Welcome to Learning from Indigenous Leaders, Climate Change and Public Health, a video series where we hear from various speakers regarding the effect of climate change on health, why it's important, and what both public health practitioners and the public can do to improve health in the face of climate change. This series was produced by the National Collaborating Center for Infectious Diseases, or the NCCID. The NCCID is hosted at the University of Manitoba, situated on the ancestral lands of the Anishinaabeg, Anishinaabeg, Dakota Oyate, Dene Sulene, and Naheithawak/Ininwak nations. It is also in the heart of the homeland of the Métis Nation. At NCCID, we strive to honor the lands and their original caretakers in our work. We acknowledge that we are on Treaty 1 land. We recognize that this and other treaties have not been implemented in good faith, as a part of an ongoing process of colonization that benefits some of us and harms others. We are committed to working with our partners towards reconciliation. In this video, we'll hear from Dr. Brittany Bingham, so let's get to know them and the work that they do.
Hi, I'm Brittany Bingham from the Sechelt Nation on the Sunshine Coast of BC. I'm the Director of Indigenous Research at Vancouver Coastal Health Indigenous Health and at the Centre for Gender and Sexual Health Equity. I'm an assistant professor in the UBC Division of Social Medicine, and I am calling in from the unceded homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, where I'm grateful to live, work, and raise my children on these beautiful territories. My research is primarily looking at community-based approaches to Indigenous health research in all different areas, but primarily focused on equity and health systems transformation.
Why is climate change important to you?
Climate change is really important to me because from a generational perspective, I want to make sure that our future generations of Indigenous people can still live and thrive on these beautiful lands and territories and continue to reclaim traditional practices on our lands. And ultimately, I want to be a good ancestor.
How does climate change affect infectious disease in public health?
Well, there's so many First Nations communities across Canada. I think about 600 First Nations communities in Canada and about 203 First Nations in BC alone. Also Métis and Inuit people and urban dwelling Indigenous people. So, there's no question that climate change and severe weather events and other infectious diseases that result will have a great impact on Indigenous people. And the burden of those impacts, I think, will be felt most by those communities and those people who are already dealing with health inequities. And Indigenous peoples are bearing the brunt of health inequity in Canada so far, and access to care is a key issue. So it's going to be a challenge for us to protect those that are already vulnerable and come up with coordinated, equity-informed approaches to climate change and to mitigating its effects, especially with infectious disease control. And I just think it's really important that our public health systems are prepared with increased surveillance strategies and mitigation, and to work with Indigenous communities closely on those approaches and developing local and culturally informed solutions to these issues.
How does climate change affect Indigenous communities?
First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples are uniquely sensitive to the impacts of climate change, given their close relationships to the lands, the waters, animals, plants, and natural resources, as well as living in geographical areas that are undergoing rapid climate change. There's a greater burden of health inequity and the impacts of the determinants of health. And these impacts are interconnected and far-reaching. We've seen over the past years increased wildfire, drought, and flooding events, and this can exacerbate health and socioeconomic inequities, chronic diseases, and further, the mental health and trauma impact that this has for Indigenous people to see these climate events impacting their traditional and ancestral territories and how closely that is tied to their well-being, health, and wellness. For example, we did see last year in BC a heat dome event, which resulted in 600 deaths in 1 week, which was the highest impact among those of lower socioeconomic status. So that's a key factor for us to consider. Other broad impacts of climate change, our ancestral lands, Indigenous ancestral lands, are so closely tied to the transmission of Indigenous knowledges and traditional practices and ceremony. So when the land is impacted, so is our culture, and so is the transmission of culture. That's really important, I think, for the future generations of Indigenous children and young people. Their sense of identity and well-being is so closely tied to the land and closely tied to culture. So much broader impacts for cultural practices and ceremony.
What can public health practitioners do to support health in the face of climate change?
Prioritizing Indigenous communities where risk is increased, and create public health emergency planning that draw on equity approaches. Having awareness of cultural safety and the cultural context within which Indigenous communities are living for emergency preparedness and prevention is super important. Knowing how many of the communities are most at risk of climate-related disasters, and working to support Indigenous communities to develop emergency planning is essential. And also infrastructure development and maintenance to prepare communities for any extreme events that may occur, but also working with communities early on to prevent these events from happening when possible. Taking climate change preventative measures must definitely, of course, remain a top priority.
What can everyone respectfully learn from Indigenous knowledges on this topic?
There's a lot to learn from Indigenous views on sustainability, biodiversity, food sovereignty, and these concepts are central to health and wellness and interconnection to the lands. Indigenous adaptation to climate change and to changes in ancestral territories and patterns has been happening since time immemorial. So Indigenous people have been doing research and science on their lands since time immemorial, and that was how Indigenous communities thrived on these territories and survived on these territories. So there are foundational values that can teach us about stewardship, about how to improve health and well-being through caring for the lands in ways that Indigenous people have always done. And we can find new ways to draw on Indigenous concepts related to climate change and combine Indigenous knowledge with Western scientific knowledge on climate change, and have these two knowledge systems work together to create effective solutions while honoring and privileging Indigenous knowledge on environment and climate change. And this is actually something that will be beneficial for all of us and not just for Indigenous peoples. So I think it is important that people take action and learn in respectful ways, and to acknowledge that Indigenous peoples are rights holders. Preparing for the health impacts of climate change requires that we consider Indigenous rights and responsibilities for their lands and ancestral ways and territories and ways of life, and that these resources are also respected and protected above all else. Indigenous-led climate adaptation and action planning and strategy policy is super important, essential that Indigenous peoples are leading the way in solutions for this, and for public health practitioners and climate change leaders to work alongside Indigenous peoples while privileging their knowledges and their leadership in this space. I think there are a number of resources available across Canada and self-directed learning resources for cultural safety and humility, and a number of online courses. And I think that the first step of that is awareness and understanding the complexity of the history of colonialism in Canada and how that continues to impact Indigenous health. And that's really important as a starting point to, again, understand those deep-rooted cultural connections to the land and territories and Indigenous land rights, and how that is really important for planning for climate change mitigation and prevention and the impacts.
Thank you for listening. All videos, infographics, and resources from the Learning from Indigenous Leaders Climate Change in Public Health series are available on the NCCID website.